Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for an ACEEE webinar. My name is Dave Ribeiro, and I'll be spending the next hour discussing the recently released 2017 City Energy Efficiency Scorecard. Before we get there though, I wanted to start with a couple administrative items. First, on 1 second, I've got some folks who have lost this sound.
Coming in patchy.
Okay, can folks not hear us?
Keep going. I think it's okay. Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Seems like it's working again, so we'll give this another shot. So again, I'll be the speaker for today's webinar. I'm Dave Ribeiro, a senior researcher on the local policy team here at ACEEE and lead author of the City Scorecard. More generally, I conduct research on local energy efficiency policy, the energy water nexus, and community resilience. I also lead technical assistance efforts to cities in the scorecard. I've also developed some tools for those communities not in the scorecard to benchmark their own energy efficiency efforts. I'm joined today by Tyler Bailey. Tyler is a research analyst on the local policy team. He's a co-author of the City Scorecard and also works on community resilience and our efforts to increase efficiency for low-income households. Tyler is going to be facilitating the Q&A today. So this is the outline we'll be following for the webinar. First, we'll start with an overview of the scorecard. So what is it? Why does ACEEE develop it? And how is the report set up? Next, we'll dive into the results. We'll start with a discussion of the top cities. Then we'll spend some time with the leading cities in each of the policy areas of the report. This will give examples of the action cities are taking to become more efficient. It will be helpful for those looking for best practices in action. Finally, we'll spend some time on the most improved cities, highlighting those who have done the most to improve in the short amount of time between the 2015 and 2017 scorecards. After that, we'll take a step back. Rather than focusing on individual cities, we'll take a look at some trends, and we'll see that cities are improving, which is great, but there's still work to do. Finally, I'll briefly describe some resources that could be helpful for both cities in the scorecard and communities that are not. So let's go ahead and get started with the first part of the webinar here. So what is the City Scorecard? It's a report we release every 2 years, benchmarking the energy efficiency efforts of 51 large cities in the U.S. We generally focus on the central cities of the largest metro regions. We released the first report in 2013, the second in 2015, and a couple weeks back we released the 2017 edition. The scorecard has a couple goals. To start, it is the first report to rank cities exclusively on their energy efficiency efforts, identifying those excelling and those with the most room for improvement. In the process, it creates some friendly competition among cities to move up their rankings and become more energy efficient. Second, the focus on policies and other initiatives is meant to identify action cities can take to improve efficiency. By doing so, it offers the beginnings of a roadmap for any local government aiming to improve its city's energy efficiency. Cities can see where they perform the best and where they didn't fare quite as well to get an idea of policies they might want to prioritize in the future. The scorecard is also filled with examples of cities implementing best practice policies. Others can benefit from the lessons of cities by using these examples from peers to inform their own activities. So in the scorecard, we assess cities across 5 policy areas, the 5 you see up here. The 50+ policy metrics in the report are organized into one of these 5 areas. The first is local government operations. Here, the focus is on what cities can do to make their own operations more energy efficient. Second, we have community-wide initiatives. This focuses on cross-cutting topics that affect overall community-wide energy use. For example, we look at efforts to mitigate urban heat islands and planning for combined heat and power or district energy. Third, we focus on energy efficiency efforts for private buildings. Fourth, we have energy and water utilities, where we evaluate the energy efficiency offerings of the energy utilities serving cities, including whether these offerings reach underserved segments of the population. We also look at the efforts of drinking water and wastewater utilities. Finally, we have transportation policies. Here we look at transportation system efficiency, including things like transit, sustainable freight, location efficiency, and the compactness of cities. And we also look at vehicle policies as well. Here we have the distribution of points across the policy areas. The maximum number of points a city can earn is 100. Local government operations receives the least amount of points at 10, while transportation policies and buildings receive the most at 30 and 28 respectively. We made a change to the point distribution this year, de-emphasizing local government operations. We reduced the number of points from 15 in the last edition to 10 here. Our analysis of energy data shows that local government energy use typically doesn't exceed 5% of community-wide energy consumption. This new point allocation more closely approximates the sector's share of community-wide energy use while still reflecting the importance of leading by example. We reallocated the 5 points across the other policy areas. So what we have here is an added level of detail. So in the table, you can see the 5 policy areas again that I just mentioned: local government operations, community-wide initiatives, buildings, energy and water utilities, and transportation policies. But you also see the categories of metrics within these policy areas. These categories organize the 50-plus metrics in the report. Each category you see here would have 3 or 4 other metrics nested underneath them. We evaluate cities on best practice policy metrics. These metrics score cities based on nuanced, qualitative policy information. Cities earn points for policies that will lead to more efficient outcomes. For example, we'll take community-wide energy efficiency goals, so the row under the community-wide initiatives row there. What do we do? What do we mean by that metric or that category? There we assess cities based on targeted established citywide or reduce greenhouse gas emissions citywide. Where we could, we went beyond simple policy adoption to score cities based on policy implementation. So again, we could go back to the community-wide goals example. Not only do we score cities based on the existence of those goals, but we also set them based on the progress they have made towards those goals. We made several methodology changes this year, including one in particular I want to flag, in a couple categories highlighted in red. Now, efficiency to underserved markets, particularly low income and households. We do that in the utility policy area and transportation policy area. So for the utility policy area, we evaluate the efficiency offerings of utilities that target low income. Getting back up momentarily, and if you do hear us, please let us know. We focus on Okay, can folks hear us now? If folks can hear us, if they can let us know, we would appreciate that, and we'll continue on with the webinar. Excellent. Okay, very good. Okay, so I'm going to start with this slide again. It seems like this is one of the areas we started having issues. If you're having issues with the sound, please let us know, and we'll work on getting it fixed again. So going back to the policy areas and the subcategories here, we made several methodology changes this year, including one I wanted to flag. It's the 2 categories of metrics that are highlighted in red. In this edition, we assess efforts to bring energy efficiency to underserved markets, particularly low-income and multifamily households, and we do that in a couple policy areas. Under energy and water utilities, we evaluate the energy efficiency programs offered by utilities that are targeted to low-income households as well as multifamily households. We also look at this under transportation policies. We assess cities based on whether they have incentives to either help develop or preserve affordable housing in transit-oriented developments. So I'm not going to go into any more detail on the metrics here, but I'd be happy to address them during Q&A. So maybe this is a good place to stop quickly. Tyler, have there been any clarifying questions?
Yeah, so one question was where they can find the city scorecard?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find the city scorecard by going to ACEEE's website, aceeee.org, and then going to our local policy section, and one of the first drop-downs under that will have a link to the city scorecard. But I will have a link to the publications page, which the city scorecard at the very end of this presentation. So you'll be able to see the direct URL as well.
That was it.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's move on into the second part of the presentation, the results of the scorecard. So we have the map here containing the ranks of the cities from the 2017 City Scorecard. I know these results likely will not be a surprise to most of you since the report has been out for a couple weeks. But for the 3rd edition in a row, Boston took the top spot in the City Scorecard. New York again achieved the 2nd rank in the City Scorecard, and then Seattle moved up 1 spot to 3rd. From there, we can see the top 10 cities in green on the map scattered across the country with more representation on both coasts, as well as a representative in the Midwest, Mountain West, and Texas. Now, the cities in blue, so those ranked 11th to 20th, give us an interesting story this year. Several of them made significant jumps, and 3 of the 4 most improved cities are actually in this grouping. You can tell those by the stars next to the city names. So in this grouping, we have San Diego, Phoenix, and Kansas City. Beyond the most improved cities, we also have other very large improvements among the cities in this group. You can take Orlando. It jumped 10 spots to 20th overall due to lots of policy activity, including its recently adopted Building Energy and Water Efficiency Strategy. Another way to look at this map is to look at it regionally. And you can see that each region has at least 1 city in the top 10. So in the Northeast, the leaders are obviously Boston and New York. If you go in the Midwest, you see Chicago at number 7th overall, followed closely behind by Minneapolis. In the Southeast, Atlanta continues to be the leading city for efficiency, but as I was just mentioning, Orlando is gaining on them. So that will be a close race for the 2019 scorecard. If you look in the South Central area around Texas and Oklahoma, you see Austin is the leading city there. And then if you look along the West Coast, you see a lot of competition with Seattle at the very top, but Portland and Los Angeles tied for 4th directly after that. Now let's take a few minutes to take a deeper look into Boston. The city maintained its top spot and also improved by 2.5 points in the process. The city continues to do well across the board, but really excels for its building policies. It also earns perfect marks for energy and water utilities. And you can really see the strength of these 2 policy areas by looking at the chart up here. As you can see, the middle bar
in each column is the median score across the cities in the scorecard. The green bar are Boston scores, and you can see for both buildings, policies, and energy and water utilities, Boston is way above the median and head and shoulders above the rest. So there's a lot we can discuss to describe why the city is doing well, but I'm going to stick with the activities in these couple policy areas. So I'll start with buildings policies. So there, Boston adopted the Massachusetts Stretch Energy Code. It requires new buildings or those undergoing major renovations to exceed the base energy code by 20%. The city also adopted the Building Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance in April 2013, which requires large commercial buildings to benchmark their energy and water use using Energy Star Portfolio Manager and report the data to the city annually. Turning to energy and water utilities, a few things to mention there as well. The Renew Boston program is a partnership between the city and its utilities, Eversource and National Grid. The program is meant to inform Boston residents and businesses about utility-sponsored energy efficiency services, thereby increasing participation in those utility programs. Both utilities also heavily invest in their energy efficiency programs, spending a lot in those programs and achieving high level of savings. So one thing to note is the link at the bottom of this slide here. If you were to click on that, that would take you to a score sheet that goes into even more detail on the reasons Boston is doing well across the 5 policy areas. So one resource to be aware of. So at this point, I want to take a deeper dive into some leading cities from each of the 5 policy areas. This will reveal some specific policies and programs cities are pursuing, providing examples that may be of interest to the folks on the webinar today. So we'll start with local government operations. In this policy area, 5 cities were tied for the top spot. We'll take a look at 2 cities, Denver and Washington, D.C. All of the cities, though, had goals for energy efficiency. They had efficiency integrating into their procurement policies, and they also had sound asset management as well. So let's start with Denver. So Denver's 2020 goals include a target to reduce energy consumed in city buildings, the city's airport, as well as city vehicles by 20% compared to a 2012 baseline. The city has also taken steps targeted at its existing buildings. For example, the city completed a facility condition and assessment program in 2014. As part of that program, the assets in the city, they were reviewed for their condition and to see where energy efficiency retrofits could be made. And the city recently completed its first energy performance contract that covered 14 city buildings. Next, turning to Washington, D.C., like Denver, D.C. has a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well as energy use. The Green Building Act of 2006 sets efficiency requirements for new buildings. So it calls for new city building designs to earn an Energy Star target score of at least a 75. And then the Clean and Affordable Energy Act of 2008 helps target existing buildings. It requires that the energy and water performance of large buildings be benchmarked annually. So now turning to community-wide initiatives, here 2 cities earned perfect scores, namely Austin and Minneapolis. Both of them have citywide efficiency goals, strategies to reduce urban heat islands, and are planning for future combined heat and power or district energy systems. Austin is one of only a handful of cities that's established community-wide goals for both energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions. The city has adopted a goal to achieve 0 net GHG emissions by 2050 and is on track to surpass an interim goal for 2020. The city is also working with its utility, Austin Energy, to construct district energy systems in several targeted redevelopment zones. And Austin is also mitigating the urban heat island effect with policies that require cool roofs and protection of trees on private land. Turning to Minneapolis, their climate action plan has goals to reduce community-wide greenhouse gas emissions and also has a goal to increase energy efficiency by 15% in residential buildings and 20% in commercial and industrial buildings. The city has also identified high priority areas for new district energy systems, and the city has 2 urban heat island mitigation goals. The first is to maintain the city's 31% tree canopy level, and the second one is to plant at least 6,000 trees annually on public land. So now turning to buildings policies. A number of cities here are really paving the way with aggressive policies that address high energy consumption in buildings. So Boston, Los Angeles, Austin, New York, and Seattle have the highest scores here, but we'll focus on Boston and LA. So we mentioned some of Boston's activities before, but here we can add a little bit more detail. So I already mentioned the stretch code earlier, but Boston also scores well for its compliance efforts for the building code. For example, it requires building performance testing and verification of compliance. The city also has internal staff dedicated solely to energy code compliance. And as mentioned before, the city also has a disclosure ordinance that's been in place since 2013, already mentioned that. And then there's Article 37 of the zoning code, which requires that all projects achieve at least the certifiable level of the LEED certification. And Boston's Interagency Green Building Committee verifies that each project meets the certification standards, so there is a compliance mechanism here. Next we have Los Angeles. So Los Angeles's existing Buildings, Energy, and Water Efficiency Program has established energy auditing and retrofit requirements for both commercial and multifamily buildings. As part of that program, Los Angeles requires all buildings that are over 20,000 square feet to annually benchmark their energy and water use. Another policy of note is their PACE program, which offers energy efficiency financing for residential and commercial building owners. And also, like all California cities, LA enforces the 2016 California Energy Code and the 2016 California Green Building Energy Standards. Turning to energy and water utilities, here Boston, San Francisco, and Seattle earned the top scores. Their scores were due in part to local policy, but also due to the actions of the utilities serving these cities. Again, we'll take Boston, who, as I mentioned, was the leading city in this area. We already discussed Renew Boston in some detail, but one additional note is that Boston is working with its utilities on a joint marketing effort to increase residential home energy efficiency activities in low and middle income neighborhoods. The city is also a strong advocate for increased spending requirements for energy efficiency projects from its utilities. Also, Boston sits on the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council, actively advocating for policies requiring utilities to expand the availability as well as the granularity of energy consumption data. Seattle, like Boston, while its utilities have high levels of spending on energy efficiency programs and are achieving high levels of savings from those programs. The electric utility, Seattle City Light, provides funding to the Low-Income Weatherization Program administered by Seattle's Office of Housing. This particular program provides efficiency measures to single-family and multi-family low-income properties. Seattle also has a goal in its water system plan to reduce total average water use as well. In transportation policies, two cities clearly rose to the top: Portland and New York City. Both have several initiatives to reduce energy use in the transportation system. We'll start with Portland, who is the leading city here. Their 2035 transportation system plan includes goals to increase the amount of commuters and residents that bike and walk to get around the city. And the Climate Action Plan has goals to reduce transportation-related carbon emissions. The zoning code also works to increase location efficiency. It encourages mixed use and infill development along all portions of the city's main streets, and their zoning map identifies specific mixed-use centers. The city is also one of the few in the report who have a plan to increase efficiency in freight. So its plan, the Sustainable Freight Strategy, identifies actions related to truck parking and loading zones, street design best practices, last mile solutions, and a host of other things to reduce energy use in freight. Turning to New York City, the New York City Transportation Strategic Plan focuses on safe, green, smart, and equitable transportation in the city. The plan outlines 105 initiatives, including improving street safety to encourage walking, expanding biking lanes, and enhancing transit. The city zoning code designs special purpose districts for the creation of mixed-use development in the city. And the zoning code, that is, also eliminates parking requirements in all transportation zones. Finally, New York's inclusionary housing program, R10, includes several incentives to encourage developers to build affordable homes in transit-served areas. So what can we take away from these 5 previous slides? There's obviously lots of examples of cities pursuing strong energy efficiency policies and innovative strategies. So when cities are considering what they can do better, there are really lots of options. So cities can adopt energy savings targets for greenhouse gas emission targets like Minneapolis and Austin, while community-wide goals are best. Starting with local government operations is often a good stepping stone. Cities can lead by example by focusing on their own operations, going back to the examples that we had for Denver and Washington, D.C. Cities can also work to increase access to energy data. Cities can adopt policies to improve efficiency in new and existing buildings. Like Boston, this could take the form of potentially adopting a more stringent building code or other building requirements or policies to increase efficiency, or perhaps something more akin to Los Angeles' recent achievement with its audit, retrofit, and benchmarking strategy. If you're served by an investor-owned utility, cities can partner with them to expand access to efficiency programs. As we discussed, there's the Renew Boston example, but there's also great examples from Chicago and Minneapolis as well. And finally, cities can work to decrease transportation energy use and can look to some of the examples we have from Portland and New York City. It's important to keep in mind, though, that there's really no silver bullet when it comes to the policymaking process here. Cities will need to see the results and develop customized road plans. There are some core foundational things that any city can do, even if they aren't in the scorecard, as I mentioned, but cities should focus on their own priorities of their leadership. So now I want to turn to some most improved cities. So these cities show that by embracing energy efficiency, cities can really improve and in some cases do it pretty quickly. So as a reminder, there are 4 most improved cities in the scorecard. 3 of them are in the southwest corner of the country there, and the other one is in Kansas City. So Los Angeles earns double accolades in the scorecard. In addition to being a top 5 city, it was the most improved city, increasing its score by 25 points since 2015. Since our first scorecard back in 2013, Los Angeles has gone from 28th to 4th place. A big reason for its improvement this time was their new energy and water efficiency program that we've discussed a few times. Following closely behind Los Angeles is San Diego, who improved its score by 24 points. Policies adopted as part of the city's climate action plan led to some of the improvement. For example, the plan codifies goals to reduce energy use by 15% in select homes and to reduce community-wide emissions by 15% by 2020. The plan also established goals to reduce vehicle miles traveled and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. Kansas City increased its score by 14 points and moved up 8 spots in the rankings. The highlight among the city's policy achievements is the adoption of the Energy Empowerment Ordinance, which requires energy benchmarking in large buildings. Phoenix was another of our most improved cities, capturing the 14th spot overall with an improvement of 13 points. The city increased its score due to the adoption of the 2050 environmental sustainability goals, which include both energy savings and climate goals. It also has a target calling for 40% of the population to commute by walking, biking, transit, or car share. So now we're going to move on to the next part of the webinar here. We're going to take a bit of a step back, not so much focus on individual city achievements, but look at more trends across the scorecard as they relate to scoring. So the first thing to note is that city scores are improving, and this graph shows that. So you have the change in points from the 2015 edition on the y-axis there, and the cities are on the x-axis. Rather than listing individual cities, we group them into tiers of 10 here. So tier 1 is the top 10 cities, tier 2 are cities 11 through 20, and then so on and so forth out to the 5th tier. So Boston would be represented by the bar on the far left, and Birmingham, the city ranked 51st, would be represented by the bar on the far right. What you can see here is that most cities are improving. The number of cities that made sizable gains is, well, it's really impressive. 32 cities improved their score, and 11 did so by double digits. Getting back to my point from earlier, though, the Tier 2 cities really saw some substantial improvement. These, as a reminder, are those cities who are ranked 11th to 20th overall. Each of the 10 cities in this tier improved, and the median change in score was an increase of 12 points. I think many of these cities are beginning to emerge as energy efficiency leaders. So this includes cities like San Diego, Phoenix, Kansas City, and Orlando. And I think we may see them knocking on the door of the top 10 sooner rather than later. When assessing scoring changes, though, we need to take a look at the policy activity to assess whether scoring changes are due potentially to methodology changes as we make those updates to make sure that we stay current, or whether the changes are due to changes in policy activity. And as we really dug in here, we saw that cities have made real progress since 2015, especially for building policies. For example, 8 cities have adopted new benchmarking and transparency policies, or they have expanded or advanced policies that they already had on the books. And you see the 8 cities listed up there on the slide. In addition, in the past year, 7 cities have also adopted more stringent building energy codes. We also see that turning to community-wide activities, that 4 new communities have adopted energy savings targets citywide. And this actually brings up the total amount of cities who have established either energy efficiency goals or climate-related goals to 35 of the 51 in the report. We also see some positive developments for transportation as well. So 3 cities have adopted vehicle miles traveled reduction goals, or greenhouse gas reduction targets for the transportation sector. And we've also really seen a growth in the amount of bike share programs. So in the 2013 scorecard, where we only evaluated 34 cities and the sample size was smaller, only a quarter of the cities had bike sharing programs. In the last edition, where we increased it to 51 cities, half of the cities had bike share programs, and now we see that 3/4 of those cities have them. So it's been quite a growth in this area. The past 2 slides are certainly encouraging. Cities are clearly prioritizing efficiency and doing so in different ways, but there is still room to do more here. In this particular graph, we have all of the city scores. You can see the max score on the far left, followed by Boston, and then moving down the line. As you can see, though, only 1 city earned more than 80% of the points, obviously Boston, and only 18 cities earned more than 50% of the points. This is better than last time. Last time there were only 13 or so cities who broke the 50-point mark. But that being said, this also shows that there's still more room for cities to pursue more activities. So we wanted to dig into that and see where cities can improve by the largest margin. So this chart helped us figure that out a little bit. We converted each city's score in each policy areas into a percentage and charted it up here. So what this really shows is the distribution of scores within each policy area. We found a few interesting things, especially for buildings policies and transportation policies. For buildings policies, you can see that there is a small cluster towards the top there where 5 cities earned about 90% of the points. So there's clearly a cohort of cities who have separated themselves from the pack. But if we look at transportation, we see something a little different. Namely, we see folks lagging a little bit behind here. So if you sort of set a threshold at 70%, you'll see in several of the other policy areas, many cities are over that. But in transportation policies, only 2 of the cities broke that threshold. And if you look at the clusters, the largest concentration really is between 20% and 45%. So most of the cities earn fewer than half of the points here. There's a number of things cities can do to improve, including increasing location efficiency, concentrating on making their freight system more sustainable, as well as focusing on energy efficiency opportunities for low-income households when it comes to transportation as well. So now I'm going to wrap up, and then we're going to move to a Q&A. So the City Scorecard is a report benchmarking the energy efficiency efforts of large U.S. cities. It really highlights specific actions cities can take, and by doing so, it can inform a policymaking process in cities. The scorecard's findings show that cities are continuing to pursue energy efficiency. Boston, New York, and Seattle were leading the way, but as we've discussed, we see lots of improvement. Over 60% of the cities, or 32 to be precise, improved their scores, and most did so by a wider margin than in the previous report. Leading the way in terms of improvement are Los Angeles with a 25-point improvement, and then San Diego, Kansas City, and Phoenix with the substantial improvements of their own. However, cities can certainly do more. As I was just saying, only 18 cities earned more than 50% of the points. So cities can use their score in the city scorecard to create roadmaps for improvement, but there are certainly foundational policies cities can pursue to save energy, especially if they're at the beginning stages. And the specific activities to keep in mind here are things like setting goals, whether they're community-wide or for local government operations, adopting a more stringent building energy code, or if that authority rests at the state level, advocating for the state to adopt a more stringent code. There is partnering with energy utilities to increase participation in utility programs, and then we're working to reduce vehicle miles traveled in transportation as well. So before we move to Q&A, I just wanted to leave folks with a couple additional resources for cities who are either looking to improve or even for those not in the scorecard who are interested in tools that could be helpful for their own cities. So first, I just wanted to mention the city and regional score sheets that we have for the city scorecard. So for each of the 51 cities, we have a score sheet. We also have 5 regional score sheets, as well as one that summarizes the trends for the United States. You can find all of these by clicking the URL at the bottom of the screen there. The other thing we have is our state and local policy database. So this is really the warehouse for all of the policy data that we collect for either our state scorecard, which I haven't talked about, or our city scorecard. So if a city was interested in a particular policy area, they could go into this database and they could search out all of the information related to that specific policy. They could go to specific cities they're interested in and learn more about their policy data, or even if they're interested in how their city was scored, they can see all of the policy information that we have in here so that it's a transparent process. Next, we have the local energy efficiency self-scoring tool. So this is actually something geared for cities who are not in the scorecard. We only have so much bandwidth, so we can only assess 51 cities in the scorecard, but we do think that it can be a valuable tool for other cities as well. So we created this local energy efficiency self-scoring tool, which allows any city to evaluate itself as if it was in the scorecard. This is something that we are currently updating, so it matches the methodology of the 2017 scorecard, and that will be out hopefully within the next few months. And here is one slide summarizing all these resources, and I know there's a question towards the beginning where folks could get the 2017 City Energy Efficiency Scorecard. If you click on that link there, it will bring you directly to the publications page and you can download the report. So that being said, thanks everyone for joining, and I think at this point we are going to move into the Q&A phase, and so everyone knows I see there's quite a few questions in the queue, so we will do our best to get to as many of them as we can. If we can't get to all of them, I would be happy to follow up with folks offline. That's perfectly fine. So I'd encourage folks, though, if they still have questions, to continue adding them to the queue. So Tyler, at this point, any?
Sure. Thanks, Dave. Start you off. One question was on the methodology for selection of cities. Wondering how you selected the 51 cities.
Sure. So we focused on the largest metro regions. So for the most part, we took the 50 largest MSAs and we looked at the central cities within those MSAs. Not to get into all of the details, but we sort of switched up our city selection process between the 2013 city scorecard and the 2015 and 2017 city scorecards. So there are 2 cities that don't quite fit that methodology and that we grandfathered into the city scorecard, namely El Paso and Fort Worth. But other than that, all of the cities in the scorecard are the central cities of the 50 largest MSAs in the country.
Okay, so next question is, so what have been some of the most innovative policies cities adopted this year?
Well, I think we'd have to look across the different policy areas for that. So I think going back to buildings policies, there's been a lot of activity related to building benchmarking and transparency, with 8 new cities having adopted those or expanded them in some way. We also see some of these policies attaching in requirements for improvement if cities don't achieve certain thresholds. So I think that's certainly one set of innovative practices going on. If we're looking at transportation, I think the growth in bike sharing is certainly notable. And there's also, the travel mode targets that cities have been setting and really strategies to increase multimodal transportation. On the community-wide side, I think there's been an increase in focus on ways to mitigate urban heat islands. I think Louisville is actually a good example there. Within the last couple of years, they came out with the Louisville Urban Tree Canopy Assessment and a related, I don't know if it's I forget if it's the same document, or a related action plan on specific things they can pursue. And then on the utility side of things, I would likely highlight the partnerships again. I think we see innovative partnerships forming between cities and their utilities to really increase offerings of energy efficiency opportunities. So we have Renew Boston, but we also have initiatives like Retrofit Chicago in Chicago, and we have the Clean Energy Partnership in Minneapolis between the city and its utilities. So I think there's quite a few things to highlight.
Okay, thanks. So another question relates to policy versus performance. One wanted to know whether cities are actually, or in the city scorecard, do we actually score cities based on only policies, or they're stated to do, or their actual performance in achieving those policies?
We are focused largely on best practice policies. So we do have a chapter in the scorecard analyzing city energy consumption, because we're certainly very interested in that topic, but it's difficult to accurately and fairly rate cities based on their consumption levels. For one, citywide energy use isn't available for a lot of cities. So if folks were to look into that chapter of the scorecard, folks will see we were only able to collect energy use data for 20 of the 51 cities. And even that data that we were able to collect, they were from very different time periods, and they covered different aspects of energy use, sometimes maybe just buildings, sometimes just transportation. The other thing that's tricky is to compare across cities when there are such differences in the local context that really affect energy use. And so I'm referring to things like weather, population changes, the inherent intensity of the local economy, issues such as that. So we do provide recommendations in the report for how the availability of community-wide data could be improved. So hopefully data does improve, that it's to the point where we could consider including it. But as of now, we focus largely on best practice policies, and that is also intentional because we do want this to be something that cities can use to guide their policy-making decisions as well.
Okay, so the next question relates to whether policies are city-driven or driven by the state utilities. I want to know whether we take account for maybe public ownership of utilities, or whether sort of state-level policies are driving some of these city initiatives.
Sure. So wherever we can, we try to tease out the local aspect of the policymaking process. But there are certainly metrics in here that are driven by external forces, whether it is state policy or whether it's utility policy. So just to give an example, if we're looking at building codes, there are a couple ways we evaluate that based on whether the building code is set at the state level or the local level. If the building code is set by the city, we evaluate the city based upon what it has adopted. But if the building code is set at the state level, we sort of split up the methodology into 2 parts. we will award points based upon the state-adopted building code, but then we will also provide points based upon the city's advocacy for an increased or more stringent code at the state level. So that's just to give an example where we always try to tease out the local action that could influence the state policy or the utility policy. But by and large, those are unique situations. Of the 100 points across the scorecard, I would say something like 15 points or so have that issue that we deal with.
Okay, so next question is, and you talked a little bit about the self-scoring tool, but what other efforts is ACEEE doing to engage smaller cities that aren't included in the city scorecard?
I think the self-scoring tool is one of our major ways of doing that. We do think that the best practices that we have established at the city scorecard for the cities in that report would also apply to others. So we do outreach to select communities, encouraging them to use the tool, and then we would work with them to verify their results, in some cases collect data for those as well. We have also had some, or facilitated some convenings with groupings of communities who have expressed interest in the self-scoring tool, including 8 to 12 in Virginia last year. So I'd say that the self-scoring tool is what we primarily use to engage that audience. But I guess one thing I should mention is we do offer some technical assistance to communities. So if a city is particularly interested in a certain energy efficiency policy, I'd certainly encourage them to get in touch with me, and we can certainly talk offline about that.
Okay, so another question, and you maybe leads a little bit off with our use of self-scoring tool, but do all of these policies that we use in the city scorecard apply to all cities? So there's some policies that some cities simply just can't enact for whatever reason.
So we attempt to be flexible. This is sort of similar to the issue with like state and utility policies. We try where we can to create a flexible methodology so that if there is a certain thing that one city cannot do, that there's an alternative scoring track. So I think one of the best cases there is how we treat benchmarking and transparency policies. So by and large, we assess folks based on whether they have those policies in place, whether they have pursued them. But there are a couple states that have not, where cities cannot adopt their own benchmarking policies. So Phoenix, for example, can't do that, as well as our Virginia cities in the scorecard. So in that case, we score cities based upon voluntary initiatives that they have pursued to encourage benchmarking in the community. So that's just an example of how we try to be flexible. But I mean, that being said, if you were to take the city scorecard metrics and apply them to very small cities, sort of going back to the question about the self-scoring tool, there might be some exceptions here and there that we would deal with on a case-by-case basis, but we try to largely focus on best practice policies that apply to as many cities as possible, and certainly include flexibility so we can easily adapt them.
Okay, thank you. So jumping to buildings, one question was if you could talk a little bit about zero net energy and zero net emissions and how that's incorporated within the buildings chapter.
So we don't get into that too much in the buildings chapter. So we give points based upon the building energy code, which in a lot of cases, I guess, are working towards those goals. But we don't have a metric specifically related to that. We focus on building codes, as I was saying, compliance efforts towards those, enforcement of the building code, rather, benchmarking and transparency policies, and then a host of other energy efficiency incentives and requirements, including energy audit requirements, retrofit requirements, and incentives as well.
Okay, next question is, can this methodology be applied in other countries?
Well, not, a lot of the ideas can, but the specific metrics would likely have to be adopted. And this is actually something that ACEEE has worked on. So to give an example, we have done some work in Taiwan, actually adopting adapting rather these metrics to a Taiwanese context. We'll likely be doing, or we may be doing something similar, advising an organization that is pursuing something like this in Canada as well. So I think the underlying ideas in the scorecard would be the same when applied to other places. So if we want to stay with the example of building policies, having a strong building energy code is something that's going to be applicable in different places, but the specifics of which code and which code is more stringent than another, those are all the details that would change when you move from country to country.
Okay, so here's one that's especially topical. How would the elimination or the funding of Energy Star affect cities and their efficiency policies and programs?
Good question. Well, I think many cities rely on Energy Star for their programs. To give some examples, cities have policies calling for the procurement of efficient office products, specifically Energy Star products. Many cities rely on Portfolio Manager for their building benchmarking requirements. Some even have requirements for Energy Star labels or for cities to undergo audits if they aren't Energy Star certified. So I think, eliminating Energy Star would be a major setback for cities across the country that are really trying to help their residents and businesses save energy and money. And that's not just for cities in the scorecard, but that's across the country. So, we certainly strongly support Energy Star and think it's a good use of taxpayer money. And I guess to broaden this a little bit, ACEEE has written a little more extensively on this, and I'd encourage folks to check out a couple of our recent blog posts that go into even more detail on this issue if they're of interest.
Okay, so this one you talked a little bit about earlier about sort of city policies, but specifically what accounts for the difference between our city scorecard ranking and state scorecard ranking? The example given was Hartford is 47th, where Connecticut is ranked 5th in the state scorecard.
Yeah, well, I think it gets back to the fact that we really try to tease out local policies. So, state policies might be responsible for a small percentage of the points. So the state building code, I don't remember offhand if Connecticut, if it's set at the state level or at the city level. Similarly with utilities, Hartford does pretty well for its utility efforts, which is something that is largely emphasized in the state scorecard. But other than that, when you get into the remaining, let's say 85 points of the city scorecard, it really is meant to assess local leadership and local policy. And I think, it's the case that the local policy hasn't quite caught up with the state level policy at this point.
Okay, and next, could you talk about some of the cities that dropped or had notable drops in the rankings from 2015 to now the 2017 city scorecard?
Sure. So there's a few who dropped. Houston, Texas dropped by a little more than 10 points. Charlotte dropped by about 7 or so. Those, I think, are the notable ones. A few others. In terms of the reasons why it's going to be different from city to city, there wasn't a particular, well, there's one thing I can say that did actually affect cities across the board, and that was our de-emphasis of the local government operations policy area. So as I was mentioning earlier, we used to provide 15 points for that, and in this edition we provided 10 points. So there were some cities who were leaders in local government operations who saw their scores drop, not merely because they had backslid on policy, but because of this methodology change. So that is something that applies across the board. But other than that, even in the case of other cities who dropped, not necessarily for that specific reason, when we looked into the policy data, we didn't see any notable rollbacks or anything to that effect. So even the cities who have dropped by a significant margin, I don't think it's a representation that they, have no longer think about energy efficiency.
Okay, so one attendee noticed that a lot of the most improved cities were clustered in the Southwest. Is there any explanation or reason behind that?
There isn't really. It really comes back to the local leadership there. So in the case of Los Angeles, it was largely, well, I think in one thing I can say is you have strong leadership from the mayoral level in all of those places. So if you look in Los Angeles, there was the energy and water efficiency program that I mentioned before, which was something that helped the city increase by a substantial margin. And Phoenix, there was the 2050 environmental sustainability goals, which again were sort of adopted in isolation. It was something that the city had prioritized. And then in San Diego, there was their climate action plan that really helped to drive things forward. So this is all to say that there wasn't necessarily a trend in the Southwest, but I think those areas have shown leadership. And one thing I should mention, I see we're getting close to 2, so I think maybe we'll take our last question and then would be happy to, continue answering other folks' questions offline.
Okay, so you mentioned Los Angeles' PACE program. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the value of PACE financing to cities and what effect it has on energy efficiency.
Sure. PACE financing is a relatively new strategy for funding efficiency and as well as renewable investments. I think it's really starting to take off in terms of the way it works. So you've identified efficiency upgrades but don't have the cash to pay for it. PACE financing will, cover the upfront costs and it will tack the monthly payment onto your property tax bill. Even though it's a relatively new concept, I think there's been a lot of investment in this area and a lot of job creation as well. So I think it's just another tool in the local energy efficiency toolbox that cities can use to push for more energy savings in their communities. Okay, so I think with any other questions?
Yeah, just quickly address. So the slide, I think people asked if the slides would be emailed, and I think they're going to be emailed within the next week. Is that correct?
Yes. So we're going to be following up with a link to the recording of the webinar. Hopefully the audio works for the entire recording, but we will have all of the slides as well. So that's something you will receive certainly within the next week. So thanks again to everyone who joined the webinar. And as I mentioned, I apologize for the questions we did not get to. Feel free to get in touch with me and I'd be happy to answer those. So thanks again for tuning in.